Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Het Red Axanthic ball python. The Het Red's kind of an interesting gene. As a matter of fact, if you breed two Het Reds together, you actually get a red axanthic, which looks like an axanthic, but keep in mind all the other axanthics are actually recessive mutations. It's kind of one of those genes that's a little bit confusing, because when we usually say Het for something, we're talking about a recessive mutation where you can't see one copy of the gene. And in this case, you can actually see the Het Red, and you can see some really dramatic influences when you mix the Het Red Axanthic in with other genes. So today I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Het Red Axanthic ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with this snake right here. This is the Het Red Axanthic with just one copy of the gene. As a matter of fact, if you're looking at the snake, you're probably thinking, hey, that looks kind of like a normal, classic, wild type ball python, and it's a really super subtle morph. As a matter of fact, if you actually bought this as a normal, a lot of times you probably tricked into thinking this is actually a normal until you actually bred it with some other stuff, and you can actually see a significant influence of the Het Red Axanthic when breeding with a lot of genes. So kind of the markers on this snake, if you're actually trying to pick out some of the markers for the Het Red, a lot of times you'll actually see like a clear patternless back. A lot of times they'll call it like a black back on the back of the snake. And a lot of times it's actually a lot darker than your typical normal, although I'd say it's really actually difficult to actually pick it out. As a matter of fact, I was going through some of my normal females. I have some normal females that I use as breeders, and I was actually looking at them thinking, hey, this one kind of looks like a cinnamon. This one kind of looks like a Het Red, and then some of them look like blackheads. Some of those genes are really subtle, almost normal looking. It can kind of trick you in a lot of cases. But if you actually take two Het Red Axanthics and you breed them together, 25% of the time, this is what you get. You get a red Axanthic with two copies of the gene. And it looks almost exactly like your typical Axanthic, the true recessive Axanthics, which are, they're all recessive except for this one. This is actually a co-dominant gene, and if you actually hatch these out, it's kind of an interesting anomaly. I've seen some people working with this gene, and they say that when you hatch out the visual red Axanthics with two copies of the gene, a lot of times the hatchlings will look just like this, where they'll be really silvery, kind of a black and a silver colored snake, and then as they age and mature a little bit, they'll actually get some coppery brown colors coming in through the snake, and then as they mature even more as an adult, when they're adults, they actually lose a lot of that brown and go back to almost the true axanthic look. So a lot of times they can actually change and transition from one appearance to another as they age and mature, which can kind of throw you off. If you come over here on Morphmarket.com, sometimes you can see some that have a lot of brown in, and sometimes you can see them that are silvery, and sometimes really black and white, and it really depends a lot on the age of the snake and kind of the color transition as it ages and matures, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. So when we're talking about the Het Red Axanthic with one copy of the gene, you can actually work some genes into the mix. There's probably two that are probably the most popular, and here is one of them. This is working Black Pastel into the mix. The Black Pastel is another really true dark morph. It makes some really impressive combos. As a matter of fact, if you take two Black Pastels and breed them together, you get a jet black patternless snake, probably the blackest ball python that you can get, and it works really well if you're actually shooting for panda pieds, working Black Pastel into the mix. So if you actually take Black Pastel, breed it to a Het Red Axanthic, this is what you get. You get an onyx. This is what an onyx looks like. This is really awesome. Probably one of the best dark combinations that I've seen with just two genes. Pretty awesome. And kind of the cool thing I like about this is if you look at the line right on the top of the snake, it almost looks like it has bubbles in the line. Really crazy. Not a lot of snakes actually have like this bubbly line right on top of the snake. And of course, you know, you have kind of this swiped out pattern on the side. I'm thinking that's probably mostly from the Black Pastel. A lot of times it'll actually jumble up the pattern on the side of the snake. As a matter of fact, if you're actually looking at some of the prices on these, this one is $400. So, you know, not real entry level, but not really outrageous as far as getting into some of these projects. And it's kind of the interesting thing with the Black Pastel is it's actually allelic with cinnamon, and here is the cinnamon. The cinnamon also works really well with the Het Red Axanthic, and it's probably one of the more common combinations. The cinnamon almost looks exactly like the black pastel. As a matter of fact, if you put them side by side, sometimes it'd be kind of hard to pick them out, except the cinnamon is usually not as black as the black pastel, and a lot of times the black pastel has a little more orange of a color. If you actually kind of compare them side by side, this is the black pastel, has a little more orange, and a lot of times it'll have a lot darker of a background than the cinnamon here. But if you actually mix the cinnamon in with the Het Red Axanthic, you get what is known as the gargoyle. Take a look at this thing. This is pretty crazy. It's probably one of the most common Het Red Axanthic combos over here on Morphmarket. So this is the pastel ball python. The pastel is, I'd say in most cases, the pastel actually really brings in a lot of the yellow and really brightens and enhances a lot of combinations. It also tends to reduce the pattern a lot, where you don't get a really, you know, like the Roswell gray alien heads. And kind of the interesting thing is when you mix pastel in with the Het Red Axanthic, take a look at this, you get a definite transition. You can definitely see in a lot of these cases, you can actually see kind of this coppery brown color coming in the background of the snake. And kind of the weird thing about when you mix it with pastel is you actually get a really light background, and then around all the patterns on the sides you get like a black outline, like someone took a Sharpie and drew an outline around some of these crazy alien head looking patterns on the side of the snake. Makes for a really interesting combination. And I'd say in most cases you can definitely tell that Het Red Axanthic is in the mix if you mix it in with pastel. So here is a lesser ball python. The lesser is actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. So if you breed it to another lesser or anything else like a bamboo or a Russo or a Mojave or something like that, you always get an all-white snake with bright blue eyes. Pretty awesome. And the kind of the cool thing about the lesser is if you actually breed it with some of the ones that form like the purple passions, the phantoms, the mystics, and the special, you know, if you actually mix it with lesser, you always get the all-white snake. So it's kind of the ultimate blue-eyed leucistic gene when you're shooting for the all-white snake with blue eyes. And here's what happens if you mix lesser in with the Het Red Axanthic. Take a look at this, and this is kind of, you actually can definitely see some of the brownish coppery color coming through, and you actually have, in this case, you actually can see the really open back. A lot of times the patternless back on the Het Red Axanthic transitions over into some of these combinations. So as a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the lesser, one of the characteristics of the lesser is they have these little almost bright yellow dog bone patterns right down the top of the snake. And usually when you mix other genes in with lesser, it really keeps a lot of the contrast and a lot of the almost like really reduced, almost like a keyhole, almost like it's almost more reduced than a keyhole. Sometimes it's like little floating alien heads, I guess you'd say, on this. And then if you actually mix it in with the Het Red, you can see the same pattern and the contrast from the lesser, but you can see it doesn't really have the lines right down, the little dog bones right down the top of the snake. It really mixes well. You can definitely tell both genes are in the mix in this combination. So here is the Orange Dream. This is another gene that I definitely am looking into getting into my collection. There's so many genes out there. It's like, it's so addictive. You know, I want Orange Dream, I want Leopard and Confusion and all these. I'm kind of shooting for, you know, getting a little bit every year, adding a couple more genes to my collection. And the Orange Dream is pretty awesome. Essentially, it brings out a lot of the orange in the snake, and it brings out, it really reduces the pattern. If you actually have a Super Orange Dream, especially the high intensity lines, it can make for a really super bright orange snake. And if you actually mix Enchi in with Orange Dream, it's hard to see the reduction of the Enchi because the Orange Dream really reduces the pattern. And kind of the interesting thing about the Orange Dream too is you actually have, a lot of times you'll actually have tracks on the belly that look like het pied, which is kind of an interesting anomaly. Sometimes you can actually be fooled into thinking your Orange Dream is het pied because of the lines on either side of the belly, which sometimes indicate indicates you actually have het pied. But here's what happens if you mix Orange Dream into Het Red Axanthic. Take a look at this, and this is almost the same effect as mixing it with Pastel. So you have a really kind of this brown coppery color as the background, and then around the patterns you actually have this like marker outline pattern on the sides. Makes for a really interesting effect. It's definitely obvious in a lot of these combos that you actually have Het Red Axanthic in the mix. And remember, that's kind of the definition of a codominant gene. You can actually see one copy of the gene. So if you actually mixed it with all these and it was a true recessive, you actually wouldn't see any effect unless you actually had two copies of the gene. That's pretty much the definition of a recessive. All right, so there's one more I wanted to show you here at the end. This is the bamboo, and take a look at this beauty. You may have recognized this snake. This is actually Bobby, the snake that I have around my neck at the beginning and end of every video. And I actually bought him over here at Morphmarket. And if you actually breed Het Red Axanthic to a bamboo, take a look at this. This is what you get. You get a bamboo with a brownish coppery color of the snake. It's probably one of the things that affects the bamboo more than anything else, because the bamboo is usually really visually dominant. It's really actually hard to change the bamboo and work other genes into the mix. And I'd say this is probably one of my favorite bamboos. As a matter of fact, if you actually took this and worked other genes into it, I think this would be a really good starting point for making some bamboo combinations. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Greg Underwood asks, how do you heat your snake racks? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, that was one of the questions I had when I first started breeding ball pythons. If you actually look at the racks right behind me, there's snakes in every tub, and there's hot spots in the back of every tub. I was like, all right, how in the world do you actually put a hot spot in all those tubs? And I actually got these racks from ARS Caging, and the way they do it, they actually have heat panels, metal heat panels that run in the back of all the tubs. So the tub actually slides right on top of the heat panel, and I think it covers maybe 25% of the tub. Maybe you can actually get bigger heat panels, and then I actually just used like the default ones. I think it's about 25% of the tub is actually on top of that heat panel. So there's a cool side in the front by the water, and then there's a hot spot in the back, and every single level has a heat panel. And then they actually give you this really big power strip that has like 30 different plugins. You actually plug every heat panel into that power strip, then you plug the power strip into a heat controller, and then, you know, as far as the probe placement, I usually just put the probe right in the middle of the rack and just control it that way. And as far as, you know, the amount of power and electricity that it actually uses, it really depends on your ambient temperature in your room. So I actually keep this room about 82 degrees, and I keep a hot spot of about 90. So there's only a differential of about 8 degrees between the cold side and the hot side. And this room, you know, it really depends on your room too. If you have a really well insulated room, you can actually trap a lot of the heat in here to where it doesn't really require a lot of heating. And I also keep all my rodents in this room too, which, believe it or not, adds quite a bit to the heating of this room, just keeping the couple racks of rodents in here. So I'd say overall, I haven't really measured it, but I'm sure it's not really that much when you're actually looking at how much it costs to actually heat all of these snake racks. It's kind of an interesting way to actually heat them all with, you know, all those metal strips in the back of the tubs. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.